I thought I caught my dad cheating when I saw him sitting by candlelight with a beautiful, chillingly calm woman, a hotel key between them. I recorded a video, almost destroying my parents' 30-year marriage in mere minutes of anger. But her leather bag held no love letters. It only held forged loans, fake invoices, and proof that the person betraying my family was not sitting across from my dad. He was sleeping next to me every night. My name is Lucy Howard. I am 33 years old, and I spend my days hunting ghosts in spreadsheets. As a financial fraud analyst at Cinder Trace Risk Solutions in Merrow Falls, Ohio. I have learned one absolute, unflinching truth in this world. People will look you dead in the eye, hold your hands with trembling affection, and lie straight to your face, but numbers never betray you. A ledger does not have an ego to protect. A bank statement does not feel guilt or shame. If money moves, it leaves a footprint in the digital dirt, and my entire career is built on following that trail until the ugly truth is laid bare and undeniable. I track the missing pennies, the inflated invoices, the hidden accounts. I am trained to spot the anomaly, the slight deviation in a pattern that signals human greed. Because of my profession, I look at the world through a thick, protective lens of risk assessment and calculated probability. I trust very little without verification. Yet, there was one singular institution I never audited. One foundational rock I believed was entirely immune to the rot of corruption. My parents' marriage. Growing up, Miles and Diane Howard were the undisputed gold standard of domestic life in our tight-knit, affluent community. They were the kind of couple who still held hands under the table at hospital charity dinners and shared quiet, knowing smiles across crowded rooms. Their partnership was durable, genuinely kind, and utterly devoid of the scandalous rumors that constantly plague the country club set. They had built their life brick by brick, entirely on a foundation of mutual trust and respect. That ironclad trust naturally extended to the family business, Lake Barrow Storage Group. What had started decades ago as a single gravel lot with a few tin-roofed sheds had blossomed, under my father's careful stewardship, into a sprawling chain of commercial warehouse real estate. Lake Barrow was thriving beyond expectations, providing us with a life of quiet, deeply comfortable affluence. We were respected in Merrow Falls. We were the family people came to for solid business advice, for generous community donations, for a stabilizing presence in a chaotic world. I grew up completely insulated by the absolute certainty that my family was an unbreakable fortress, safe from the greed and deception I saw every day at work. But I should have known better. Fortresses do not usually fall to invading armies hammering at the gates. They crumble from within, often starting with a single, unnoticed loose stone. Lately, that loose stone seemed to take the shape of my mother's younger brother, Calvin Sloat. Uncle Calvin was a man perpetually chasing the next big payday, a charmer with a terrible track record. His latest grand venture was a catastrophic commercial development project on the edge of town that was rapidly bleeding cash and shedding contractors. Suddenly, my mother was unusually, frantically busy. Her serene afternoons tending to her rose garden were replaced by hushed, panicked phone calls and emergency lunch meetings to rescue Calvin from his own disastrous financial decisions. My mother had always possessed a crippling soft spot for him, a lingering familial guilt rooted in their childhood that made her an incredibly easy mark for his desperate sob stories. This is exactly where my husband stepped into the frame. Perfectly positioned, Reed Mercer was everything a wealthy mother-in-law could possibly dream of. He was exceptionally polite, effortlessly articulate, and possessed a quiet, steady charm that disarmed almost everyone he met. Reed knew exactly how to pour a glass of wine to soothe a frazzled nerve, exactly when to offer a sympathetic ear, and exactly how to make my mother feel like she was managing the chaotic Calvin situation brilliantly. I loved Reed deeply for his supportive nature. He was my rock. But over the last several months, his emotional support had quietly morphed into active, structural participation. He was showing up at my parents' house more often than I was, carrying thick leather folios, sitting at the head of the table in the impromptu family meetings regarding Calvin's failing project. Reed was a logistics manager by trade, and he smoothly convinced my mother that he could help streamline Calvin's messy operations and stop the financial bleeding. I was simply grateful, relieved even, that my husband was willing to shoulder the heavy burden of my exhausting uncle so I did not have to. However, the more Reed and my mother huddled together over Calvin's mounting problems, the more my father retreated into the cold shadows. Miles Howard, a man who usually commanded any room he entered with warm, booming authority, was becoming a ghost in his own home. At first, the changes were subtle, easily explained away: a missed family dinner here, an unexplained late night at the office there. But the quiet alarms in my trained head began to ring when I noticed the cash. I handled my parents' personal tax preparations every spring, and scanning through their recent bank feeds, I began seeing repeated, highly uncharacteristic ATM withdrawals, hundreds of dollars at a time, vanishing into the ether without any matching receipts or logical explanation. Then came the second phone. I saw it by pure accident one Sunday afternoon, a cheap, plastic, prepaid device slipping out of the side pocket of his golf bag, completely separate from the sleek, monitored smartphone the company provided him. He snatched it up with a defensive, almost guilty quickness that made my stomach twist into a hard knot. He offered no explanation, and I was too stunned to demand one. The creeping unease finally crystallized into genuine, throbbing concern one rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had stopped by my parents' house during my lunch hour to drop off some redirected mail. The sprawling house was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic scratching of a heavy pen. I walked into the formal dining room to find my mother sitting alone at the massive mahogany table, blindly scrawling her signature across a towering mountain of complex legal documents. She was barely glancing at the dense pages of text, just flipping the corners and signing, flipping and signing, as if she were autographing fan mail. I stepped forward, my professional instincts flaring hot and bright. I placed my hand on the stack, stopping her pen. I asked her what in the world she was signing so recklessly without legal counsel present. She did not even look up at me properly, just offered a breezy, utterly dismissive laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Calvin just needs me to help temporarily," she said, her voice light and entirely devoid of the worry she should have been feeling. "It is just some routine bridge financing paperwork to keep his main contractors from walking off the job site. Reed looked it all over this morning before he left for work and assured me it is completely standard procedure." I wanted to grab the heavy pen from her delicate hand and snap it in half. I wanted to shake her and tell her that in my daily line of work, blindly signing standard financial paperwork was the absolute first step toward total ruin. But she was my mother, and she looked so incredibly tired, so deeply burdened by the weight of her brother's relentless failures, that I bit the inside of my cheek and stayed silent. I convinced myself, against all my professional training, that Reed would never let her do anything truly dangerous to the family estate. I trusted my husband. That night, the air inside my parents' house felt thick, heavy with suffocating, unspoken things. I found my father standing alone on the back porch, staring out at the dark, restless waters of the lake. The faint orange glow of his cigar illuminated the newly deepened lines etched into his face. In the harsh moonlight, he looked 10 years older than he had on his last birthday just a few months ago. His posture, usually so upright and proud, was slumped. I stepped out into the biting, cool air and stood quietly beside him, leaning against the wooden railing. I asked him softly if he was all right, if the mounting stress with Calvin's endless drama was finally getting to him. He did not look at me immediately. He took a long, slow drag of his cigar, the ember glowing fiercely in the dark night before he exhaled a thick cloud of gray smoke. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped entirely of its usual comforting warmth. It sounded like stone grinding against stone. "There are types of betrayal that do not start in bed," he said, the heavy words hanging in the damp air between us, chilling me to the bone. "They start in the ledgers." A sudden, violent shiver swept over my arms. I stared at his rugged profile, desperately searching for the strong, unshakable father I had known and revered my entire life. Instead, I saw a man drowning in dark paranoia, a man seeing shadows where there should be light. I told myself he was just exhausted. I aggressively rationalized that the severe financial drain Calvin was putting on the family accounts was making him bitter, resentful, and irrationally suspicious of everyone around him. I wrapped my arms tightly around my own chest, turned my back on the dark, whispering lake, and went back inside the warm, brightly lit house. I willfully ignored the terrifying truth that was already unspooling right in front of my eyes. I actively chose to believe our family fortress was still standing strong, completely blind to the devastating reality that the heavy iron gates had already been locked from the outside, and the true enemy was already sitting comfortably at our dining table. The air at the obsidian room was thick with the scent of dry-aged beef and expensive cologne. It was exactly 8:15 on a Friday evening, and I had booked this rooftop steakhouse 3 weeks in advance. I needed this dinner. After a month of suffocating tension at work and the relentless, grinding anxiety radiating from my family, I desperately wanted to look across a table and just see my husband. I wanted to spend 2 hours pretending we were just Lucy and Reed, a normal couple celebrating making it to the end of another exhausting week. The city skyline sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sweeping panoramic view of Marrow Falls that usually cost at least $300 a plate to enjoy. Reed was looking down at the wine list, the dim ambient lighting catching the sharp angle of his jaw. He looked handsome, perfectly at ease in his tailored charcoal suit. But the silence between us felt heavy. I took a sip of my sparkling water, my eyes drifting away from our table, scanning the crowded, low-lit dining room simply to avoid staring at the top of his head. My gaze swept past the bustling waitstaff, past the glowing amber bar, and settled on the elevated, semi-private booths lined against the far glass wall. My breath caught in my throat. The physical sensation was instantaneous and violent, like a heavy stone dropping straight through my ribcage. Sitting in the corner booth, cloaked in the discreet, shadowy ambiance the restaurant was famous for, was my father. Miles Howard was not alone. He was leaning forward, his broad shoulders hunched over the small, candlelit table. Across from him sat a woman I had never seen before in my entire life. She was stunning in a cold, precise way. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek knot, and she wore a tailored silk blouse that screamed quiet wealth. There was an intimacy in their posture that made my skin crawl. They were not laughing. They were not leaning back and enjoying the jazz band playing in the corner. They were locked in a tight, intense bubble of shared focus. I blinked hard, praying the dim lighting was playing a cruel trick on my exhausted brain. I prayed it was just a client, a late business dinner he had forgotten to mention. But then she reached across the table. The woman extended her hand and lightly brushed her fingertips against my father's wrist. It was a fleeting, familiar gesture, a touch that spoke of private boundaries already crossed. My father did not pull away. He did not flinch. He just kept looking at her with a heavy, serious expression. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I leaned slightly to my left, trying to get a clearer angle around the towering floral arrangement separating our section from theirs. The flickering candle on their table illuminated the space between them, lying perfectly flat on the dark wood. Positioned exactly halfway between my father's heavy hands and the woman's manicured fingers were two items: a thick cream-colored envelope and a sleek magnetic hotel room key. The air vanished from my lungs. The entire foundation of my 33 years of existence violently fractured in that single second. My father, the bedrock of our family, the man who held my mother's hand during Sunday service, was sitting in a luxury hotel restaurant with a beautiful stranger and a room key waiting between their wine glasses. Instinct bypassed logic. The trained fraud analyst in me, the woman who documented every discrepancy and logged every piece of evidence, hijacked my nervous system. My hands were shaking, but my movements were terrifyingly precise. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened the camera. I zoomed in past the ambient glow of the dining room, framing the private booth perfectly on my screen. I hit record. I captured the woman's face. I captured my father's profile. I zoomed in close enough to capture the unmistakable rectangular shape of the hotel keycard resting next to the envelope. My blood roared in my ears. I felt physically sick. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage and grief washing over me. I was filming the destruction of my parents' 30-year marriage. "What are you looking at?" Reed's voice sliced through the roaring in my ears. He had finally looked up from the wine list. He followed the direction of my phone, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. It took him less than 3 seconds to find them. I expected shock. I expected him to gasp, to drop his menu, to reach across the table and grab my hand in shared horror. Instead, Reed leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper that sounded entirely too composed. "Send that to your mother," he said. I froze, my thumb hovering over the red stop button on my screen. I looked at my husband. His eyes were locked on my father, but there was no surprise in his expression. There was only a sharp, cold calculation. "What?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a rasp. "Send the video to Diane right now. Lucy," Reed urged, his tone suddenly pressing, authoritative. "She needs to see this. She deserves to know what he is doing behind her back. Do not wait. Send it before he leaves the table." It was too fast. The reaction was too clean, too tactical. In the midst of my world shattering, a tiny clinical alarm bell rang in the deep recesses of my brain. Why was his first instinct to detonate the bomb immediately? Why was he pushing me to hit send without taking even a single minute to process the catastrophic fallout? He sounded less like a supportive husband comforting his devastated wife, and more like a manager executing a perfectly timed operational step. But the shock of seeing my father's betrayal was a towering inferno, quickly consuming that small spark of suspicion regarding Reed's behavior. I looked back at my screen. My father was standing up. He threw a few large bills onto the table to cover the check. The woman stood up a second later. She slipped the cream envelope into her expensive leather tote bag. My father picked up the hotel key, sliding it seamlessly into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. They did not walk out together. The woman turned sharply on her heel and headed toward the side exit leading to the restrooms. My father buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and walked in the opposite direction, moving with deliberate strides toward the heavy brass double doors at the back of the restaurant. Those doors did not lead to the street. They led directly to the hotel's interior guest elevators. "Lucy, send the video," Reed hissed again, his hand reaching across the table to tap the edge of my phone. I stared at the screen, at the paused frame of my father's retreating back. I thought about my mother, sitting alone in her quiet house, probably worrying about Calvin's debts, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was heading up to a suite with another woman. If I pressed send, her heart would break. The resulting explosion would be irreversible. I lowered the phone and locked the screen. I slipped it into my coat pocket. "No," I said, my voice suddenly very steady, surprising even myself. Reed's jaw tightened. "What do you mean? No, you caught him." "You have the proof." "I have a video of them sitting at a table," I replied, grabbing my purse and sliding out of the curved leather booth. "I want to know exactly what room he is going into." Reed reached for my arm, his fingers gripping my sleeve just a fraction too hard. "Lucy, sit down. Do not be crazy. You cannot follow him up there." "Watch me," I snapped, yanking my arm free. I did not wait to see if Reed would follow. I turned my back on our table, ignoring the approaching waiter carrying our menus. I moved through the restaurant quickly, dodging chairs and waitstaff, keeping my eyes fixed on the heavy brass doors my father had just disappeared behind. I was not going to blow up my family via text message. If my father was going to destroy everything we had, I was going to look him in the eyes while he did it. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind me, instantly silencing the jazz band and the clatter of silverware. The hotel lobby was a labyrinth of polished marble and mirrored columns. I kept my distance, watching his broad shoulders disappear around a corner toward the private executive elevators. My heels sank into the thick patterned carpet, muting my frantic footsteps. I slipped into the car just as the gold-plated doors of his elevator slid closed, watching the floor indicator light up floor 12, the penthouse suites. The ride up was an agonizing eternity. My chest was tight. I was bracing myself for the worst moment of my life. I pictured tangled sheets. I pictured whispered apologies. I pictured a devastation so absolute it would leave my mother hollowed out. When the elevator chimed and opened on the 12th floor, the air was cold and smelled faintly of expensive linen spray. I stepped out into a long, dimly lit corridor. At the far end, my father was just swiping the magnetic keycard against the lock of the corner suite. I hurried forward, aiming for a recessed alcove near the ice machine to stay out of sight. I needed to see if the woman was already inside. I did not make it. As I lunged for the shadow of the alcove, my father paused. He did not turn his head. He was looking straight ahead at the large, decorative mirror mounted on the wall beside the suite door. The polished glass caught my frantic, stumbling reflection perfectly under the warm wall sconces. He froze. My lungs seized. This was it. The moment of discovery. I expected panic. I expected him to drop the key, to turn around with his hands raised in desperate surrender, weaving a tapestry of pathetic lies. Instead, he simply pushed the heavy oak door open. He stood in the threshold, staring at my reflection in the glass with an expression carved from granite. "If you have followed me this far, come in alone," he said. His voice was completely devoid of warmth, guilt, or surprise. It was an absolute command. I stood frozen by the ice machine, my hands trembling violently. He did not beg. He did not try to explain. He just stepped inside and left the door cracked open. A sliver of bright, clinical light spilling out onto the hallway carpet. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to the elevator, to flee the impending trauma, but the quiet, unnatural composure in his voice pulled me forward. I walked down the hall like a condemned prisoner. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, preparing to face the destruction of my family. The suite was enormous, but it was completely wrong. There was no ambient lighting. There was no romantic music playing softly in the background. The massive king-sized bed in the adjoining room was immaculately made, the decorative pillows untouched. There was no champagne icing in a silver bucket. Instead, the massive mahogany dining table in the center of the living area had been stripped of its floral centerpieces and converted into a makeshift command center. It was buried under towering stacks of manila folders, thick accordion files, and spread out property maps marked with red ink. 4 open laptops hummed softly, their screens glowing with complex spreadsheets and data feeds. And my father was not alone with his mistress. There were 3 people waiting in the room. The stunning, dark-haired woman from the restaurant was standing by the window, but the seductive, intimate aura she had projected downstairs was entirely gone. She was wearing wire-rimmed reading glasses and rapidly typing on a tablet. Beside her stood a tall, severely dressed man adjusting his tie, and a younger woman with a sharp bob who was methodically sorting through a stack of bank statements. I stood near the entryway, clutching my purse to my chest like a shield, utterly disoriented. My brain scrambled to process the sterile, corporate reality crashing into the scandalous narrative I had built in my head. The dark-haired woman set her tablet down and walked toward me, extending a firm, professional hand. "I apologize for the theatrics downstairs," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "My name is Serena Quinn. I am an independent financial investigator. Your father retained my services privately 3 weeks ago." She gestured to the tall man. "This is Jonah Pike, Senior Litigation Counsel, and over there is Tessa Rowe, a forensic underwriter from the Commercial Lending Division." I stared at them, my mouth dry. I looked at my father. He had removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of a chair. His sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked exhausted. But the creeping paranoia I had sensed in him was replaced by a sharp, focused grimness. "I do not understand," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "I saw the key. I saw the envelope. I thought you were having an affair." "That was exactly what you were supposed to think," my father replied heavily. "It is exactly what everyone watching is supposed to think. It is a necessary smokescreen." I shook my head, my professional skepticism violently fighting the sheer absurdity of the situation. This is a trick. This is some elaborate, insane cover-up. You are paying them to act out a board meeting because you knew I was following you. My father did not argue. He did not raise his voice to defend his honor. He simply reached into the center of the chaotic table, pulled out a thick, plastic-bound legal file, and slid it across the polished wood toward me. "Read the second page," he commanded softly. "Look at the signature line. Then look at the digital routing stamp at the bottom." I stepped forward hesitantly. The analyst in me could not resist the lure of a physical document. I opened the heavy file. It was a commercial mezzanine loan application, pledging 4 of our prime warehouse properties as collateral for a staggering sum of money. The amount requested was for $2,500,000. I flipped to the second page. There, sitting starkly on the designated line, was my father's signature. It was a digital stamp, a perfect electronic replica of his handwriting. "You took out a massive loan," I said, my brow furrowing in confusion. "Why hide this?" "I did not take out that loan," he stated flatly. I have never seen that document in my life until Serena pulled it from a shadow server yesterday afternoon. Someone is leveraging the company's assets without my knowledge, bypassing all executive board protocols. I stared at the electronic signature. It looked flawless. But then my eyes drifted down to the tiny, alphanumeric string printed in the footer margin. The metadata. The digital footprint detailing exactly who had generated the document, who had requested the signature token, and what IP address it had originated from. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The originator email address was not a corporate account. It was a masked alias, a seemingly random jumble of letters and numbers ending in a secure encrypted domain. silver_foxglove88@securemail.com. My vision blurred. The roaring in my ears returned, louder and more terrifying than before. The anger about a phantom mistress vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating, icy horror that paralyzed my lungs. I knew that email alias. I had seen it exactly once, 3 months ago. I had been looking for a saved recipe on Reed's personal laptop while he was in the shower. A browser window had been left open in the background, minimizing just as I clicked. But I had seen the login screen. I had seen that exact bizarre string of words and numbers saved in the auto-fill drop-down menu. silver_foxglove88. I had completely forgotten about it, dismissing it as some weird spam account or a forgotten gaming login. But here it was, permanently stamped onto a fraudulent, multi-million-dollar loan document threatening to gut my family's legacy. I looked up from the paper. Serena, Jonah, and Tessa were all watching me with clinical, unblinking intensity. They were not waiting for me to catch up. They were waiting to see if I would break. My father stood perfectly still on the other side of the table. He was watching my face. Mapping the exact second the horrific realization took root in my eyes. He knew. He had known before I even walked into the room. The betrayal I had been bracing for was completely real. I had just been looking at the wrong suspect. My father was not the one destroying our family. The architect of our ruin was not sitting across from him in a restaurant. He was the man who had just urged me to send a destructive video to my mother. The man who poured her wine and managed my uncle's disasters. The man I slept next to every single night. The silence in the 12th floor hotel suite was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of my sudden, horrifying epiphany. I dropped the plastic-bound file back onto the mahogany table as if the paper itself were laced with poison. My husband. The man who had gently kissed my forehead exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes ago before we left for dinner. My father pulled out a heavy chair and motioned for me to sit. I collapsed into the leather seat, my knees suddenly unable to support my own weight. "Why the steakhouse?" I asked, my voice barely a hollow whisper. "Why the candlelight? The touching? The hotel key left out in the open? If you knew they were stealing, why put on a performance that would destroy your reputation in this town?" My father leaned his hands flat against the table, his posture rigid. "Because a public humiliating affair is the perfect cover for a man desperate to hide his movements," he said grimly. "About 6 weeks ago, I realized I was being anticipated. Every single time I tried to freeze a suspicious vendor account from the main office, the account was already emptied. Every time I called Jonah from my study at home to discuss an injunction, Calvin would miraculously call an emergency board vote the very next morning to bypass my authority. They were always exactly one step ahead." He walked over to his discarded suit jacket, retrieved his sleek company-issued smartphone, and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a dull thud next to the fraudulent loan application. "My phone is compromised," my father stated flatly. "My car, GPS, is being tracked. They have access to my home network. I cannot even have a private conversation in my own living room without someone listening. If I suddenly started booking secure conference rooms or hiring private security firms, they would know I was on to them. They would panic and destroy the ledgers before I could secure the proof. So, I gave them exactly what they wanted to see: an aging, stressed executive making reckless, self-destructive personal choices." Serena stepped forward, picking up the thread with clinical precision. "An affair is an emotional crisis, not a legal one. When people see a wealthy man slipping a hotel key into his pocket while dining with a younger woman, they assume moral failing, not corporate espionage. The envelope you saw downstairs did not contain love letters. It contained heavily encrypted hard drives. We meet in highly visible, public spaces because it is the only way your father can physically hand me evidence without drawing suspicion from the people monitoring him." I looked at the investigator, the sharp edges of her professionalism completely replacing the soft, seductive act she had put on downstairs. "What exactly are you investigating?" I asked, forcing my brain to switch from the mind of a betrayed wife to the mind of a forensic fraud analyst. I needed data. I needed facts to anchor me to reality before I lost my mind. Serena tapped the screen of her tablet. A complex organizational chart projected onto the blank wall beside the television. "We are tracking a ghost network of fake invoices. The money is being funneled directly into Holloway Ridge Ventures, your Uncle Calvin's company." She pointed to a cluster of red boxes on the projection. "Over the past 18 months, Lake Barrow Storage Group has paid out millions of dollars for massive infrastructure repairs that simply never happened. We are talking about invoices for completely replacing the HVAC systems at the North Terminal, repaving acres of asphalt at the Western facility, and reinforcing roofs that were just inspected and passed with flying colors 2 years ago. The money leaves Lake Barrow, routes through a maze of anonymous shell companies registered in states with strict corporate secrecy laws, and quietly bleeds into Calvin's failing commercial development project to keep it afloat." "But that is impossible," I argued, my professional training rebelling against the audacity of the scheme. "You cannot just cut checks for millions of dollars. There are strict protocols. The accounting department requires signed work orders, photographic proof of completion, and multi-tier executive approval before a vendor is even digitized into the payment system." Tessa, the forensic underwriter, spoke up for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but laced with devastating clarity. It is entirely possible if the person controlling the digitization process is the one creating the fake vendors. The room spun. A cold, nauseating dread settled into the pit of my stomach. "Read," I whispered. "Last spring," my father said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your mother convinced me to let Reed consult on modernizing our accounts payable systems." He argued that our manual approval flows were outdated and slowing down operations. I trusted him. I gave him administrative access to build a new, automated vendor portal. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back a wave of physical sickness. The pieces were clicking together with terrifying, undeniable precision. Reed had built the very system designed to protect the company, which meant he knew exactly how to build the back doors to exploit it. He could approve a fake vendor, route the invoice, authorize the payment, and scrub the access logs so it looked like a routine automated disbursement. But the horror went deeper than that. As a fraud analyst, my entire job was catching people who did exactly this. I spent my evenings sitting on our living room couch, drinking tea, and venting to my husband about my cases. I had told him exactly what red flags auditors look for. I had explained how we track metadata, how we spot duplicate billing cycles, how we unravel shell companies. I had essentially given him a masterclass on how to commit the perfect financial crime and evade detection. He had not just betrayed my family. He had weaponized my own career against me. My expertise had been his shield. I opened my eyes and looked at my father. "What about Mom? Does she know? Is she helping Calvin steal from us?" My father's face tightened. A flicker of profound, agonizing pain cracked his stoic facade. "I do not know, Lucy. And that is the most terrifying part of this entire ordeal." He ran a heavy hand over his tired face. "Your mother has always had a blind spot when it comes to Calvin. She feels responsible for him. She has co-signed loans for him in the past, entirely out of a misguided sense of sibling loyalty. I know she has been signing emergency bridge financing documents lately without reading them, but I refuse to conclude that she is a willing accomplice in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme designed to bankrupt her own family. I will not destroy a 30-year marriage on a terrible assumption." He leaned closer to me, his gaze intense and unwavering. "That is why we are operating in the shadows. I need irrefutable, concrete proof. I need to know exactly where the money is, who authorized it, and who is actively hiding it. If she is a victim being manipulated by her brother and your husband, I need to be able to protect her from the legal fallout." He pointed a stern finger at me. "Think about what happened downstairs. Think about how quickly Reed pushed you to send that video. He wanted you to react emotionally. He wanted you to call your mother, screaming about an affair. He wanted her to storm down here in tears." Jonah, the lawyer, finally spoke, his voice carrying the heavy weight of legal strategy. "If you had sent that video, a massive, highly public domestic crisis would have erupted tonight. Your father would have been immediately disgraced. The board of directors would have convened an emergency session by tomorrow morning to suspend him pending an investigation into his moral conduct and fitness to lead. And while your entire family was consumed by the emotional wreckage of a massive divorce scandal," Serena added bluntly, "the people actually stealing the money would have had unimpeded access to the servers." Jonah nodded. "They would have used the chaos to wipe the remaining digital trails. By the time the dust settled on the divorce, the money would be gone, the ledgers would be scrubbed clean, and your father would be out of power, completely unable to prove anything." I sat perfectly still, processing the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the trap that had been set for me. My husband had taken me to a romantic dinner, looked me in the eyes, and calmly tried to use my own heartbreak as a weapon to destroy my parents. He had counted on my impulsivity. He had relied on my fierce loyalty to my mother to trigger the exact explosion he needed to cover his tracks. I had almost handed him the detonator. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy reality freeze the last lingering remnants of my shattered heart. I was no longer a wife mourning a dying marriage. I was an analyst staring at the biggest fraud case of my life, and the primary target was sleeping in my bed. The steering wheel felt rough against my palms, but my hands were completely steady. I pulled into our quiet, tree-lined driveway 45 minutes before my husband usually arrived on a Friday night. The house was dark, sitting perfectly still under the glow of the street lamps. From the outside, it was the picture of suburban success. A 2-story colonial with manicured hedges and a freshly painted front porch. Inside, it was a crime scene. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The silence of the empty house pressed against my eardrums, thick and suffocating. Every inch of this space suddenly felt contaminated. The framed wedding photos lining the hallway, the custom linen curtains we picked out together, the expensive wool rug in the living room. Everything was built on a foundation of rot. I walked through my own home like a ghost, completely detached from the life I had lived just 3 hours ago. I did not even realize I was crossing the threshold into a war zone. I was just acting on pure analytical instinct. I went straight to the small den we used as a home office and booted up our shared desktop computer. The blue light from the monitor washed over the dark room. I opened our joint checking and savings accounts, scrolling past the mundane grocery bills and utility payments. Then, I dug deeper into the cloud storage drive where we kept our digital tax records and long-term financial planning documents. I was looking for the bleed. If Reed was orchestrating a massive fraud network at Lake Barrow Storage Group, he would need to filter his cut somewhere. It took me exactly 22 minutes to find the anomaly. Buried in a subfolder labeled under routine household expenses from 2 years ago, I found a digital ledger tracking outgoing wire transfers. The money was flowing out of a secondary, individual account Reed had opened without my knowledge. The destination was a limited liability company called Birch Lantern Services. The amounts were carefully structured to avoid automatic banking flags. $4,500 here, $8,200 there. Over the course of 14 months, a small fortune had vanished into this corporate black hole. I opened a new tab and ran a quick public record search on Birch Lantern Services. It was a shell, a hollow entity registered to a commercial mailbox address 2 states away. But the outgoing expenses from Birch Lantern were even more disturbing. The money was not just sitting in an offshore account. It was actively funding a parallel life. I traced the payments. There were monthly fees for a climate-controlled storage unit on the north side of town. There were heavy deposits for a short-term luxury apartment lease in the financial district. There were even multiple campaign donations of $5,000 each to local city council members who sat on the commercial zoning board. These were the exact politicians who had the power to approve or deny the land permits for my Uncle Calvin's failing development project. Reed was not just stealing money, he was buying political leverage. He was building an entire shadow infrastructure using funds siphoned directly from my family. My chest tightened as I clicked back into our shared tax folder. I opened the digital copy of our joint return from last spring. As I scrolled to the final page, a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Hovering right below the signature line was a high-resolution, perfectly cropped image file of my own handwriting. It was my signature. He had clipped it from a physical document, scanned it at a high resolution, and saved it as a transparent digital stamp. I stared at the screen, a wave of profound violation washing over me. This was the exact type of digital forgery tool needed to bypass the internal security protocols at my firm. If he had this, he could authorize anything. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my secure work laptop. I powered it up, typed in my heavily encrypted credentials, and accessed the remote server logs for my employee identification number. I filtered the data by date and time, looking for any login sessions that occurred outside of my normal working hours. The results populated instantly. My heart stopped. There were multiple weekend logins. One session lasted for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon exactly 3 weeks ago. I checked my mental calendar. That was the weekend I had driven across town to spend the entire day with my mother, helping her prune her rose bushes and trying to calm her anxiety about Calvin. I had left my work laptop sitting on the kitchen island. Reed had been home alone. He had opened my computer, used my saved network credentials, and stamped my digital signature onto fraudulent vendor approvals. He had used my name, my clearance, and my spotless professional reputation to authorize the theft of my own family's money. The sound of the garage door opening violently shattered the silence in the house. I flinch-eyed, snapping the laptop shut. The heavy rumble of his car engine died out. The door connecting the garage to the kitchen clicked open. Footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. I sat in the dark office for 5 seconds, forcing my breathing to slow down. I locked away the panic. I buried the devastation. I stood up, smoothed down the front of my dress, and walked out into the kitchen. Reed was hanging his expensive charcoal coat on the rack. He looked up as I entered, his face the very picture of gentle, exhausted concern. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and soothing. He walked toward me, reaching out to touch my arm. I rushed back as fast as I could. I paid the bill and just left. "Are you okay? You vanished so quickly." He was looking at my eyes, searching for the wreckage. He was waiting for the tears, the screaming, the broken confession that my family was destroyed. He was quietly probing to see exactly how much damage the bomb had caused. For the first time in our entire marriage, I looked straight into my husband's eyes and felt absolutely nothing but ice. The man I loved did not exist. He was a phantom. "I am fine," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am sorry I ran off like that. You were right to try and stop me." Reed tilted his head, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What happened? Did you follow him up to the room? Did you see the woman?" "I followed him to the 12th floor. I lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. I waited by the elevator, but he did not go to a room with her. He went into one of the small executive conference suites at the end of the hall. The door was propped open. Reed went perfectly still. The subtle, comforting warmth dropped from his face for a fraction of a second. "A conference suite." "Yes," I continued, feeding him the exact narrative he desperately needed to hear to feel safe. There were 2 other men in suits waiting for him. They had blueprints and legal pads spread all over the table. It was just a late-night business meeting. The woman from the restaurant must have been a commercial broker or something. I felt completely ridiculous standing there. I offered a small, self-deprecating laugh. I was just so stressed about everything with Calvin lately that my mind jumped to the absolute worst conclusion. I panicked over nothing. I watched him swallow hard. The tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. His carefully constructed trap had failed to detonate, and I could see his brain rapidly calculating this new variable. But he recovered flawlessly. He exhaled a long, dramatic sigh of relief and pulled me into a tight hug. "Thank God," he whispered against my hair. "I was so worried for you. I am so glad it was just work. You know your father, always grinding late into the night." His hands rubbed my back. It felt like spiders crawling over my skin. I stood perfectly rigid in his arms, staring blankly over his shoulder at the dark kitchen window. "I have a terrible headache," I murmured, pulling away gently. "I think the adrenaline crash is hitting me. I am going to take a shower." "Take your time," Reed said, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "I will make us some tea." I walked down the hallway, stepped into the master bathroom, and closed the heavy oak door. I turned the lock until it clicked sharply into place. I turned on the shower faucet, letting the water run at full pressure to drown out any noise. Then, I collapsed to my knees on the cold tile floor. I gripped the edges of the porcelain toilet bowl and dry heaved violently in the deafening roar of the running water. My stomach twisted into brutal, agonizing knots, trying to physically purge the reality of the monster standing just on the other side of the wall. Tears blurred my vision, hot and stinging, but I refused to make a sound. After 5 agonizing minutes, the sickness passed. I stood up on shaking legs and walked over to the vanity. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My makeup was smeared, and my eyes were hollow and red. I turned on the cold water tap and splashed my face until the numbness returned. I grabbed a towel and dried my skin with slow, deliberate movements as I stared at the stranger in the glass. A terrifying, unbreakable resolve settled deep into my bones. I was not going to pack a bag. I was not going to call a divorce lawyer in the morning and cry about a broken heart. I was going to stay in this house. I was going to smile at him over morning coffee. I was going to drink the tea he made me. And from this exact second forward, I was going to use every single ounce of my professional training to quietly, methodically dismantle his entire life. I was not going to try and save my marriage anymore. I was going to build a cage. The atmosphere inside my house shifted from a quiet masquerade to a suffocating, high-stakes psychological war. Reed was a predator, and though I had convinced him the trap at the steakhouse failed, his predatory instincts were still fully activated. He could smell that something in the environment had fundamentally changed. I was too quiet. I stopped bringing my secure work laptop into the living room after dinner. When I did work, my screen was angled away from the door. The first real test came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 4 days after the incident at the restaurant. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when Reed walked in, carrying his tablet. He casually mentioned that his phone was dead and asked to borrow my laptop to check a quick shipping invoice for Calvin's project. I told him it was in the office, fully knowing I had spent the weekend tightening every security setting I had, changing every administrative password, and adding biometric 2-factor authentication to every device I owned. I heard the heavy click of the keyboard down the hall. 2 minutes later, he walked back into the kitchen. His face was perfectly smooth, but his eyes were hard and searching. "Did your IT department force an update?" he asked lightly, pouring himself a glass of water. "I tried to use your old passcode to get into the guest profile, but it locked me out." "Oh, yes," I replied smoothly, sweeping the chopped onions into a hot pan. "Corporate mandated a massive security overhaul on Monday. We have to use thumbprints and secondary PIN codes for everything now. It is incredibly annoying. Do you need me to unlock it for you?" "No, it is fine," he said softly, taking a slow sip of his water. "I will just charge my phone." He did not ask again, but from that moment on, the surveillance began. I felt his eyes on me when I texted. I noticed him lingering by the bedroom door when I took phone calls. He was looking for the leak, completely unaware that the leak was staring right back at him over the dinner table. Meanwhile, the battlefield outside our home was rapidly expanding. Calvin was no longer just quietly siphoning funds. He was actively preparing a hostile takeover. Having failed to trigger a messy, immediate divorce through Reed's setup with me, Calvin pivoted to a character assassination campaign. He began whispering to the board of directors, pushing a vicious, carefully constructed narrative. He claimed my father was suffering from severe mental decline, making erratic, emotional decisions, and was entirely under the manipulative control of a younger woman who was bleeding his accounts dry. The poison seeped into the community fast. My mother called me on Thursday afternoon, her voice thick with tears and a profound sense of humiliation. She had just returned from a luncheon for the hospital foundation. The women she had known for 2 decades had suddenly stopped talking when she approached their table. The pity in their eyes was worse than outright mockery. "They are saying terrible things about your father. Lucy," she sobbed into the phone. "They are saying he is funding a second life. Calvin warned me this was happening." He told me Miles was losing his grip on reality and squandering the family legacy. I defended him, but now I do not know what to believe. Calvin might be the only one actually trying to protect what is left of the company. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to scream the truth through the receiver. I wanted to tell her that her beloved brother was the architect of her humiliation, but my father's strict warning echoed in my head. We needed irrefutable proof, not emotional chaos. I murmured empty comforts to my mother, promising her we would figure it out, all while my nails dug painful half-moons into my palms. The desperation of Calvin and Reed's alliance became violently clear the very next night. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, the silent alarm at my father's lake house office was triggered. Serena, Jonah, my father, and I convened the following morning in the sterile 12th floor hotel suite. My father looked grim. The break-in had been flawlessly executed. The perpetrators had bypassed the outer perimeter cameras and picked the heavy deadbolt on the office door without leaving a single scratch. They had not touched the expensive artwork, the antique silver, or the petty cash box. They had taken exactly one thing: a heavy fireproof lockbox hidden under the floorboards beneath my father's desk, which contained the physical backup hard drive of his private financial records. They knew exactly where to look, my father said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Only 3 people in the world knew about that floor safe: me, Diane, and Calvin. Diane told him. He manipulated her into revealing my secure storage, and then he sent someone to gut it. I felt a cold spike of fear. If they have the drive, they have your private ledgers. They know we are tracking the shell companies. Serena leaned against the mahogany table, completely unbothered. She took off her wire-rimmed glasses and offered a sharp, predatory smile. "Let them have the plastic," she said calmly. "The drive they stole was a decoy. I swapped it out 48 hours ago. The real data is entirely cloud-based, heavily encrypted, and split across 3 separate secure servers in different jurisdictions. Furthermore, I have put an automatic disclosure protocol in place. If any aggressive legal action is taken against your father, or if anyone attempts to compel me to surrender my findings, The entire unredacted cache of evidence automatically transmits to Jonah, the federal authorities, and the state attorney general's fraud division simultaneously. She looked directly at my father. They think they disarmed you. They just wasted their time stealing a brick. The sheer brilliance of it gave me a fleeting rush of triumph, but the reality of living with the enemy quickly dragged me back down. That evening, Reed came home energized, carrying a bottle of expensive red wine. He poured 2 large glasses and sat across from me at the kitchen island. "I spoke with your uncle today." Reed sighed, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "It is getting really bad. Lucy, your dad is completely refusing to sign off on the standard operational budget for next quarter. Calvin thinks Miles is having a breakdown. He said Miles is acting entirely out of emotion, completely detached from the fiduciary reality of the company." I froze, the rim of my wine glass hovering inches from my lips. Acting entirely out of emotion, completely detached from the fiduciary reality. That was not conversational phrasing. That was corporate legal jargon. More importantly, it was the exact, word-for-word phrasing Calvin had used in a confidential, anonymously leaked email sent to the board of directors just 12 hours prior. I knew this because Serena had intercepted the draft. There was absolutely no way Reed could have known those specific words unless he had helped write the email himself. They were coordinating so closely, they were beginning to share a single brain. They were getting sloppy. "That is terrible," I forced myself to say, taking a sip of the bitter wine. "I hope they can work it out." "Me too," Reed murmured, reaching across the marble island to squeeze my hand. "I am just trying to keep the peace." The final confirmation of his panic came the next morning. Reed had left for the gym at 6 o'clock. I went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen smelled faintly of acrid smoke. I frowned, checking the stove and the toaster. Everything was off. I walked over to the stainless steel sink and looked down at the garbage disposal. Clinging to the damp metal sides of the basin were several small, charred fragments of thick paper. Someone had burned a document over the sink and hurriedly washed the ashes down the drain. But they had not been thorough enough. I grabbed a pair of tweezers from the bathroom and carefully extracted the largest surviving pieces. I laid them flat on a white paper towel under the bright under-cabinet lighting. Most of the text was destroyed by the fire and water, but one edge remained intact. It showed a string of bold, printed numbers: 9, 0, 4, 2, 7. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I did not need to check my secure files to know what those numbers meant. 904 was the specific vendor classification code Reed had assigned to Birch Lantern Services in the digitized payment portal. He was destroying physical evidence inside our home. The walls were closing in on him, and he was desperately trying to burn the bridge before we could cross it. I pulled out my phone, turned on the macro lens, and took 6 high-resolution photographs of the charred fragments from every angle. Then, I carefully scooped the ashes into a small plastic Ziploc bag, sealed it tight, and buried it at the very bottom of my tampon box under the bathroom sink, a place I knew my husband would never dare to look. I washed my hands, wiped the stainless steel sink perfectly clean, and started the coffee maker. When Reed walked through the door 30 minutes later, sweating from his run, I handed him a hot mug and smiled, playing the perfect, oblivious wife to a man who was already standing on a trap door. By Wednesday morning, the 12th floor hotel suite had transformed from a makeshift command center into a highly efficient war room. The suffocating anxiety of the past few weeks had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating momentum. Every rogue piece of the puzzle was finally snapping into its designated slot. Jonah stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table, looking unusually energized for a man who had barely slept in 3 days. "I have the injunction," Jonah announced, dropping a thick manila envelope onto the center of the table with a satisfying thud. A federal judge signed the temporary freezing order on all disputed Lake Barrow assets at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. It legally covers the commercial accounts, the identified shell company aliases, and the newly mortgaged properties. My father exhaled a long, heavy breath, rubbing his temples. "So we freeze them out right now. We shut the doors." "No," Jonah corrected sharply, tapping the envelope. "If we execute the order this afternoon, the banking institutions will automatically notify the account holders. Calvin and Reed will instantly know we are on to them. They will panic, destroy any remaining secondary evidence, and hire defense attorneys before we can corner them. We are holding the activation order in escrow. We drop the net only when they are standing directly under it, completely exposed." I stepped forward, plugging a small encrypted flash drive into the main projector resting on the credenza. "I can prove my mother is standing completely outside that net," I said, my voice steady. The crushing weight of uncertainty regarding her involvement that had been sitting on my chest finally began to lift. I clicked a button on the remote, and stark black and white security footage from the county property registry office filled the blank wall. The recording was time-stamped exactly 2 weeks ago at 3:15 in the afternoon. "I pulled a favor with a forensic auditor I know at the registry office," I explained, gesturing to the screen. "Watch Calvin's hands." On the projection, my mother sat at a broad wooden desk, looking profoundly exhausted and distracted. Calvin stood hovering directly over her right shoulder like a dark shadow. He placed a massive stack of legal documents in front of her. As she picked up her pen to sign, Calvin's left hand smoothly slid over the top of the pages, physically covering the dense, fine print addendums detailing the staggering loan amounts and property liens. He was talking quickly, pointing only to the blank signature lines at the very bottom of each page. He flipped the heavy sheet so fast she barely had time to blink, let alone comprehend the legal terms she was authorizing. "He is intentionally not letting her see the mezzanine loan declarations," Serena observed. Her eyes narrowed with professional disgust at the screen. "He is burying the toxic assets beneath standard, routine operational paperwork. She is completely innocent," my father whispered, staring at the grainy image of his wife being actively manipulated by her own flesh and blood. The profound relief in his voice was heartbreaking, immediately followed by a surge of quiet, righteous anger. "She is just signing where he tells her to sign because she truly believes she is saving his business from bankruptcy. She is a victim of her own misplaced familial guilt," I confirmed, closing the video file and turning off the projector. "We do not have to worry about protecting her from the legal fallout of a fraud conspiracy. We just have to protect her from them." Serena leaned against the wall, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "We have significantly more ammunition than just a rigged signing," she said, a sharp, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "I spent the last 48 hours putting extreme pressure on a local commercial roofing contractor. He is the guy whose company name is printed on the massive invoices for the Western facility repairs. It turns out, he is not exactly a hardened criminal mastermind. When I sat down in his office and casually mentioned the phrase federal wire fraud, he completely broke down. He signed a sworn affidavit stating Calvin paid him $50,000 in cash to draft completely fake structural inspection reports for a roof his crew never even touched. Tessa, the forensic underwriter, immediately chimed in, stepping up to the table. "And I have successfully compiled the internal banking communications," she said, tapping a neat-bound stack of printed emails. "I have documented, time-stamped proof that Miles contacted the commercial lending division 4 months ago to flag suspicious activity on the secondary accounts. This completely destroys Calvin's false narrative that your father is acting erratically or trying to cover up his own financial mismanagement. Miles was the one blowing the whistle from the very beginning. He cannot be the architect of a crime he actively tried to report." The trap was fully constructed. The steel jaws were sharp, primed, and perfectly hidden beneath the surface. We just needed the rats to step directly onto the trigger plate. We needed a public stage, a strict deadline, and a piece of irresistible bait. The annual Lake Barrow Foundation Charity Gala was scheduled for Friday night. It was the premier social and philanthropic event of the season in Marrow Falls. A formal black-tie affair crawling with local politicians, wealthy investors, and every single voting member of the company's board of directors. It was the exact arena Calvin was planning to use to publicly humiliate my father, push a vote of no confidence, and officially seize control of the trust. "We use the gala," I stated, looking around the room at my unexpected allies. "But we have to make them aggressively accelerate their timeline. They need to believe they have already won the war, so they let their guard down and finalize the last round of wire transfers while we are actively watching the servers." I knew exactly how to play the man sleeping in my bed. I knew his blind spots. That evening, I returned home from work at exactly 6 o'clock. Reed was sitting in the living room, casually scrolling through his phone with the television playing softly in the background. I walked into the kitchen, deliberately leaving my cell phone face up on the marble island, right near the edge of the sink. I made sure the screen lock was completely disabled. Then, I turned on the water faucet, making enough noise to cover the sound of my footsteps, and conveniently walked out to the garage to check the recycling bins. Before I left the room, I had pre-scheduled a text message to myself from a secure burner number I had saved in my contacts under Jonah's name. The message was brief, devastating, and entirely fake. It read, "I spoke with Miles. He cannot handle the psychological pressure of Calvin's board vote tomorrow. To save Diane from a massive public scandal at the gala, he has agreed to sign a private letter of immediate resignation tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock, right before the red carpet opens. Keep this completely quiet until the paperwork is filed." I stayed in the cold garage for exactly 4 minutes, counting the seconds in my head. When I walked back into the warm kitchen, my phone was exactly where I had left it. But Reed was no longer sitting on the couch watching television. He was pacing rapidly in the front hallway, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, speaking in a rapid, hushed voice. "No, you do not understand." I heard Reed whisper harshly as I quietly approached the archway, keeping myself hidden in the shadows. "We have the green light early. He is folding before the party even starts. He is stepping down at 5 tomorrow. Yes, initiate the final accounting sweeps right now. Cue the shell company transfers for tomorrow night. As soon as the ink is dry on his resignation, we move the rest of the capital out of the state." I stepped back into the kitchen, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. He had swallowed the hook whole. Reed and Calvin truly believed they had successfully terrorized my father into total submission. They thought they had secured their hostile takeover without a fight. Blinded by their own arrogance and the intoxicating promise of millions of dollars, they were dropping all their careful security protocols to execute the final, massive cash grab before my father could potentially change his mind. They were actively lining up the digital money transfers, creating a fresh, undeniable trail of evidence that would trigger Jonah's freezing order the exact second the funds tried to leave the primary accounts. Our retaliation was no longer relying on angry confrontations, tearful accusations, or desperate emotional appeals. We did not need to scream at them in our living rooms to prove they were monsters. We had simply built a transparent corridor of temptation, locked the side doors, and watched them sprint full speed toward their own absolute destruction, driven by nothing but their own dark, unquenchable greed. All we had to do now was put on our formal evening wear and wait for the music to start. The rain started falling just after dusk on Thursday evening, washing the streets of Marrow Falls in a cold, unforgiving gray. We were less than 24 hours away from the Foundation Gala. The air felt thin, completely drained of oxygen. I drove to my parents' house, knowing I had to sever the final emotional thread holding my mother to her brother. I found Diane sitting alone in her glass-enclosed sunroom, staring out at the dark garden. A cup of untouched chamomile tea sat on the small table beside her. Entirely cold, I sat down on the floral cushion opposite her. I did not bring the massive accordion files or the complex banking spreadsheets. I only brought 2 single sheets of paper. I needed to give her just enough of the truth to stop her from blindly defending Calvin tomorrow night. But I deliberately held back the absolute, crushing entirety of the betrayal. She needed to stay composed enough to walk into that ballroom. I leaned forward and placed the first paper gently on the glass table. It was the undeniable proof of the fake invoices Calvin had been aggressively routing through the company. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the terrible weight of what I was about to do. "Calvin is not failing because of bad luck or a poor market. He is actively stealing from Lake Barrow. He is trying to bankrupt the trust and blame Dad for the missing capital." Diane stared at the paper. Her hands began to tremble. She shook her head, a desperate, instinctual denial forming on her lips. "No, Lucy, you do not understand his business. He is just overwhelmed. He is messy with his bookkeeping, but he would never deliberately destroy us." I placed the second piece of paper on top of the first. It was the internal security log from my firm, showing the weekend login session, right alongside the forged digital signature. "Calvin could not bypass the security protocols alone," I continued, my voice breaking slightly despite my strict resolve. "He needed someone on the inside, someone who controlled the digital vendor portals." Mom. Reed used my secure professional credentials. He forged my signature to authorize the fraudulent payments. He used my name as a legal shield to protect himself and Calvin. The silence in the sunroom was sudden and absolute. It was the sound of an entire world view shattering into microscopic pieces. Diane looked from the paper to my face, her eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization. It was not just about money anymore. It was about me, her beloved. Perfect son-in-law had actively weaponized her daughter's career to commit a felony. The dam broke. Diane completely collapsed into herself, letting out a raw, agonizing sob that seemed to tear out of her throat. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. The guilt she had been carrying transformed into a suffocating, toxic cloud. "I brought him in," she wept, her voice muffled and broken. "I invited Reed to those meetings. I told him all of our private family vulnerabilities because I thought he was helping. I handed him the keys to our lives. I brought the destroyer right into our dining room." I moved across the small space and wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders, letting her cry. When the heaviest wave of her grief finally subsided, she leaned back, wiping her wet cheeks. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of all their usual bright warmth. My parents gave me everything. Lucy, she whispered into the quiet room, her voice hoarse. When your grandparents passed away, they left the entire controlling stake of the storage business to me. They gave Calvin a small cash settlement and nothing else. They always said he lacked discipline. They always favored me. I spent my entire adult life watching him fail, knowing he felt humiliated by my success. Every time he asked for a loan, every time he needed a bridge payment, I gave it to him out of my own private accounts. For 15 years, I have been secretly paying his debts. I thought if I just gave him enough grace, it would balance the scales of our childhood. I thought my loyalty would fix him. She looked down at her empty hands. My loyalty just bought him the shovel he used to dig our graves. I left my mother sitting in the quiet shadows of the sunroom, her grief finally anchored in cold reality. I drove straight back to the 12th floor hotel suite. The war room was empty except for my father. He was sitting at the massive mahogany table, surrounded by towering boxes of financial ledgers. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned his collar. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield he had already lost. I sat down in the chair next to him. We did not exchange pleasantries. The time for polite family fiction was over. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked, looking directly into his tired eyes. "When you first suspected the money was bleeding out, when you hired Serena to fake the affair. Why did you shut me out? I am a fraud analyst. I could have helped you trace the accounts months ago." Miles let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look away. For the first time in my life, he did not try to shield me from the ugly truth. He just handed it to me. "Because I knew Reed was involved," my father said softly, his voice thick with regret. "And I know how much you love him. A daughter's instinct is to protect her home. Lucy, I was terrified that if I brought you into the investigation, you would confront him. I was terrified you would instinctively side with your husband and inadvertently warn him before I had enough evidence to stop the bleeding. I thought I had to choose between saving the company and destroying your marriage. So I chose to play the villain." The words hit me like physical blows. He had weaponized his own reputation, willingly becoming a disgrace in my eyes. All because he believed my love for a monster was a fatal liability. The tragedy was not that he was wrong. The tragedy was that he was absolutely right. If he had told me a month ago, I would have defended Reed aggressively. We sat in the quiet room for a long time, not speaking about love or offering empty apologies. We just pulled the boxes closer and began sorting through the final printed transaction logs together. This was our reconciliation, not built on pretty words, but on shared pain, undeniable facts, and the mutual, burning desire to tear down the men who had betrayed us. Just before midnight, the heavy suite door clicked open. Serena walked in. She was not carrying her usual tablet. She was holding a single printed sheet of paper. Her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of pure, icy professionalism. "I just intercepted an automated confirmation from the primary corporate travel account," Serena announced, placing the paper squarely in the center of the table. "Calvin and Reed are not planning to stay and manage the company after the board vote." I leaned over and looked at the document. It was a flight itinerary. 2 first-class one-way tickets departing from the regional airport to an international hub with notoriously lax extradition laws. The departure time was scheduled for 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. "They are cashing out," my father stated, his jaw clenching tight. They are going to use the gala tomorrow night to officially force my resignation, trigger the massive external wire transfers under their newly acquired authority, and board a plane before the banks even open on Monday. Exactly, Serena confirmed. Tomorrow night is not just a hostile takeover anymore, it is a smash and grab. If we do not execute the trap flawlessly before the gala ends, the money will cross international borders, and they will simply vanish. I drove back to my dark, quiet house an hour later. Reed was already asleep in our bed, his breathing deep and even, completely untroubled by the destruction he was planning to unleash in less than 24 hours. I walked into my walk-in closet and opened my heavy wooden jewelry box. Sitting on the velvet lining was a diamond tennis bracelet. Reed had given it to me for our 5th wedding anniversary. He had fastened it around my wrist and told me I was the only true partner he would ever need. I picked up the cold, glittering metal and let it slide through my fingers. I decided right then that I was going to wear it to the gala tomorrow. I wanted it resting against my skin all night. It was no longer a beautiful gift. It was a physical reminder of a completely fake marriage. A cold chain linking me to a man I was about to destroy. Everyone in that hotel room understood the terrifying reality of our situation. If tomorrow night failed, if Calvin managed to sway the board, or if Reed noticed the trap before he stepped into it, we would lose everything. The legacy of my family, the millions of dollars in stolen capital, and the truth itself would all simply disappear on a morning flight, buried forever under a mountain of lies. I set the bracelet down next to my black evening gown and turned off the light. The waiting was finally over. The grand ballroom at the Marrow Falls Country Club was suffocating beneath the weight of heavy crystal chandeliers and hundreds of forced, polite smiles. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low, murmuring hum of the city's elite. At the head table, my family sat perfectly aligned, a picturesque illusion of wealth and unity. I wore my black evening gown, the diamond tennis bracelet heavy and cold against my wrist. I looked across the table at Reed. He smiled warmly at me, raising his champagne flute in a silent, loving toast. He thought he had already won. He thought my father was going to quietly hand over his resignation letter in a few minutes to avoid a public massacre. But the resignation letter did not exist. At 8:30, Calvin walked up to the grand podium at the front of the room. He tapped the microphone, the sharp feedback silencing the ballroom. His face was painted with a mask of profound, tragic solemnity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Calvin began, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings, "it is with a deeply heavy heart that I must interrupt tonight's festivities to address an urgent, unavoidable crisis regarding the leadership of the Lake Barrow Foundation. As many of you have unfortunately heard through recent whispers, my brother-in-law, Miles Howard, has been suffering from a severe lapse in judgment and mental fortitude." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. My father sat perfectly rigid, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Due to a string of reckless, emotional decisions and a catastrophic mismanagement of trust assets, I am officially motioning for the immediate suspension of Miles Howard from his position as chairman, Calvin declared loudly, his voice rising with theatrical righteousness. He has compromised our financial security to fund a hidden, deeply immoral secondary lifestyle. We cannot allow his personal failings to destroy this family's legacy. Reed stood up from his chair and walked over to stand right beside Calvin. My husband looked down at the floor, shaking his head slowly. He looked exactly like the reluctant, heartbroken son-in-law, a man simply trying to hold his fractured family together in the face of absolute tragedy. I could see the board members at the front tables nodding in sympathetic agreement. The entire room was tilting violently in Calvin's favor. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, drawing every eye in the room toward me. I did not wait for permission. I walked straight to the audiovisual control booth at the side of the stage and handed the terrified technician my encrypted flash drive. I took a wireless microphone from the stand. "Before the board members cast their votes to suspend my father," I said, my voice ringing out sharp and perfectly steady, "I would like to submit a piece of visual evidence regarding this alleged immoral lifestyle." I clicked the remote in my hand. The massive projection screen behind Calvin and Reed instantly lit up. It was the high-definition video I had recorded at the rooftop steakhouse. The footage showed my father leaning across the candlelit table, the beautiful dark-haired woman touching his wrist, and the hotel room key resting between them. The ballroom erupted into genuine, chaotic gasps. Several women covered their mouths. The board members stared in appalled silence. On the stage, Calvin allowed a brief, triumphant smirk to flash across his face. He thought I was emotionally breaking down. He thought I was finalizing his coup for him out of sheer, betrayed anger. Reed looked at me, his eyes wide with fake sympathy, completely oblivious to the trap slamming shut around him. I let them have their victory for exactly 15 seconds. Then, I clicked the remote again. The romantic video vanished. It was instantly replaced by a stark, high-contrast digital scan of a commercial mezzanine loan application. "The woman in that video is not my father's mistress," I announced, my voice slicing through the shocked whispers like a newly sharpened blade. "Her name is Serena Quinn. She is a forensic financial investigator. And the only reason my father had to meet her in public under the guise of an illicit affair is because the men currently trying to steal this company were actively monitoring his personal phone, his email, and his private office." The smirk instantly fell off Calvin's face. Reed stepped backward, his posture stiffening. I clicked the remote. The screen flashed to the massive organizational chart of shell companies. Over the past 18 months, Lake Barrow Storage Group has hemorrhaged millions of dollars, I stated, walking slowly toward the center of the room. The money was routed through fake vendor portals to pay for structural repairs that never happened. The capital was funneled directly into Birch Lantern Services, and ultimately, into Holloway Ridge Ventures. Calvin Sloat's failing real estate project. I clicked the remote again. The grainy security footage from the county property registry office began to play. The entire ballroom watched in dead silence as Calvin hovered over my mother, aggressively turning the pages and physically blocking her from reading the loan addendums she was signing. "My uncle did not call this emergency vote tonight to save the company," I continued, the microphone amplifying my cold fury. "He called it to force an executive leadership change so he could authorize one final, massive wire transfer. He planned to drain the remaining capital and flee." The screen changed one last time, displaying the confirmation receipt for 2 first-class, one-way flight tickets departing at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. The ballroom exploded into shouting. Board members were standing up, pointing at the stage. Calvin gripped the edges of the podium, his face entirely drained of blood. He looked frantically at the exits, but Calvin could not bypass the digital vendor payment systems on his own, I said, turning my body to face my husband directly. Reed was staring at me, his eyes wide with a horrific, paralyzing panic. The charming mask had completely melted away, revealing the terrified coward underneath. He needed someone inside the network, someone who understood administrative architecture, someone who could steal my professional credentials, forge my digital signature, and use my career as a shield to commit federal wire fraud. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung violently open. Serena, Tessa, and Jonah marched straight down the center aisle, their footsteps echoing like gunshots over the clamor of the crowd. Jonah walked directly up to the stage. He did not ask for a microphone. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and slapped it hard against Calvin's chest. "Federal injunction," Jonah declared, his deep voice carrying over the noise. "Signed by a federal judge at 8 o'clock yesterday morning. All financial assets tied to Lake Barrow Storage, Holloway Ridge Ventures, Birch Lantern Services, and your personal accounts are officially frozen. The civil authorities have already locked the servers. You cannot move a single penny." Tessa stepped up next to him, dropping a massive stack of bound folders onto the table. "I have the sworn affidavits from the roofing contractors confirming the invoices were completely fabricated, along with the undeniable metadata logs tracing the fraudulent approvals straight to Reed Mercer's residential IP address." From the head table, my mother slowly stood up. The tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. But her posture was straight and unyielding. She looked at her younger brother, the man she had spent her entire adult life trying to save. "You used me, Calvin," Diane said, her voice trembling but incredibly loud in the sudden quiet of the room. "You weaponized my guilt about our childhood. You exploited my love for you to steal from my husband and my daughter. You are nothing to me anymore." Calvin stumbled backward, bumping into the stage curtains. He had absolutely nothing to say. Reed scrambled down the steps of the stage. He rushed toward me, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Lucy, please," he begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Listen to me. We can fix this. Just let me explain. Please, let us just go outside and talk in private." He reached out to touch my arm. I took a sharp step backward, completely out of his reach. I unclasped the diamond tennis bracelet from my wrist and let it drop onto the floor. It hit the polished wood with a pathetic, hollow clatter. I reached into my small black evening clutch and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. I shoved it directly into his trembling hands. "I do not want to talk, Reed," I said, my voice empty of anything resembling love. "Those are divorce papers. The appendix attached to the back is a printed copy of your digital footprint inside my secure network. I handed the raw data over to the Federal Fraud Division at noon today. They are waiting for you." Reed stared down at the papers, his chest heaving as the absolute reality of his destruction finally crushed him. Uniformed security guards were already moving through the crowd, blocking the main exits and surrounding the stage. The board members were aggressively demanding answers from Calvin, who was desperately trying to push his way through the curtain behind the podium. My father walked around the head table, taking my mother's hand in his. He looked taller, the heavy burden of the past few months completely lifted from his shoulders. All access codes to the company accounts had been successfully revoked while Calvin was giving his speech, restoring my father to his rightful position of absolute control. He walked over to me and placed a strong, comforting hand on my back. We did not stay to watch the authorities arrive to escort them out. We did not need to. The poison had been completely extracted from our lives. We turned our backs on the chaos, walking together down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. We left the gala not because our family was suddenly perfectly whole and undamaged again, but because the betrayal that tried to consume us had finally been dragged into the blinding light, exactly where it belonged, right in front of the very people it was meant to deceive. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Olivia Revenge Stories and like the video so more people can discover it.